Thanks for coming back from lunch. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this session on data issues for children who have been internally displaced, with a special focus on climate mobility. My name is Jasper Linke, and I'm assessment specialist at Impact Initiatives REACH and co-chair of IDAC's Working Group 3 on improving data on internally displaced children. The topic we're discussing today is particularly urgent, complex, and under-resourced because it's at the intersection of data to address internal displacement, support children, and address the consequences of climate change. And each of these topics individually already are urgent, complex, and under-resourced. As we already heard, at the end of last year, an estimated 32 million children were internally displaced worldwide, according to the latest estimates of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. That's 42% of all IDPs, yet data specific to these children, their experiences and their vulnerabilities remains largely invisible. And this invisibility is especially concerning as climate change increasingly drives displacement, compounding risks and uncertainties for children and families already in precarious situations. We hope that the session today will be insightful in two ways. First, we want to identify and discuss critical data challenges in tracking and supporting internally displaced children, with a special focus on their vulnerabilities to climate change. Second, we will explore approaches for improving data accuracy and availability to enhance responses to the needs of these children. It's an honor to moderate this discussion today alongside such distinguished speakers and participants. We're fortunate to have a diverse panel of experts with us today who will bring a global, national, and also thematic perspectives to these issues. So first we have Christelle Casaba. She's the head of programs at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, and she's my co-chair of IDAC's Working Group 3. She will launch our discussion today by providing an overview of global data trends and challenges related to IDP children, and she will particularly focus on those in the context of climate change. Then, on the other side of the room, zooming in from the global to the national level, Geoffrey Akor from Nigeria's National Bureau of Statistics will share insights into the Nigerian displacement data collection efforts and also challenges, and particularly focus on climate mobility. Then Miriam Kushnitsky is regional advisor at the Joint IDP Profiling Service, JIPS. She will discuss how durable solutions profiling can better incorporate child-specific data. And then Sebastian Palmas is a migration and displacement data specialist at UNICEF. Sebastian will examine the intersection of climate mobility and child displacement, identifying key trends and key risks and data gaps. And last but not least, we have Josiah Kaplan, child protection specialist at UNICEF, and Josiah will introduce the IDAC UNICEF evidence agenda with a focus on climate mobility. So this session is designed to be interactive, and I hope that this will still be the case because we started a bit late due to the late lunch. So during the next we will begin with the presentations from our fellow panelists, and then this will be followed by an audience Q&A, and hopefully also an open discussion. So we hope we still have time for that. So during the next hour, during the presentations, you all will have the opportunity to submit and vote or rank questions you would like me to ask to our panelists. And for this, in a few minutes, actually, Christelle, during her presentation, will display a Slido QR code, which you can scan with your phones. And then you can submit the questions you would like us to discuss, and then also vote on those questions through your phone. And you will have the opportunity to familiarize yourself with this app by participating in a little quiz that we will do in a couple of minutes. And the QR code will be the same for this quiz and also for the audience questions. Our speakers also have prepared a couple of questions for you that we would like to ask to all of you, just to benefit from the wealth of expertise in this room today. I just hope that there's still enough time in the end. So without further ado, I'm handing over to Christelle, who will now give us a global overview of the state of data on internally displaced children. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasper. And before the overview, I think you're all very excited to try this interactive Slido we were just talking about. So let me see if this works first. Yes, that's me. And that's the Slido. So those of you who have never done this before, please actually pick up your phones. That's the only session where you are allowed to use your phone while we're speaking. And go to slido.com. And there you can either scan the QR code, really easy, or enter the event code 4148328. And if this works, we're really excited because we're trying it out live, you should be able to see a question to you to begin with. This is intended to kick off the topic, also test your knowledge, and apparently ask your names as well first. That's great. Very good. So I counted around 40, 45, 50 people in this room. So let's wait until we have a few more responses to make sure you're all connected, because we will be using this page not only to ask you questions, but also to allow you, as Jasper said, to type down any question you would like to ask the panel. And you can do so throughout the entire session, not just my presentation, but also the presentations of my colleagues. And you can also, as Jasper said, just vote on other questions that other colleagues here have already noted. That's good. That's a good number of responses. Can we see the actual question? Maybe. Yes. Great. All right. This is timed, so you only have a few seconds to respond. So quickly. Which do you think was the main driver of internal displacement in 2023? Conflicts and violence, disasters, or climate change? All right, I'm very excited that you got this wrong, because this means you will actually perhaps listen very carefully to the presentation. And this was a trick question, so do not feel bad if you responded conflicts and violence. The question was actually about the driver of internal displacement. And by this, we mean the number of movements, not the number of people who are leaving in internal displacement at the end of the year. That's a very, very tricky nuance that we're struggling to explain every time we give a presentation at IDMC. So I'm glad to have this opportunity once again. Conflicts and violence are indeed the cause that has led most people who are today living in internal displacement to be displaced. But disasters are the driver that lead to the highest number of movements every year. Every year so far, the number is higher than the number of movements caused by conflicts and violence. I'll explain the difference in a second. And as for climate change, that was also a trick response because we actually don't know, which is also the topic of today's session, really, and why we're here together. So this slide here is looking at the number of internally displaced people, IDPs. That's the number of people we take stock of at the end of the year. We say at the end of the year, we try to get the closest update to the end of the year as we can. But of course, depending on the country and the data providers, the update can be once a year, every quarter, every month. So we try our best to arrive at this figure every year, which we publish in May every year, to give a sense to the global community of whether this phenomenon of internal displacement is increasing or decreasing. As you can see, and you all already know, it has been consistently increasing for as long as we've been collecting data. So there's never yet been a year where the figure was lower than the previous year. You can see on the graph at the bottom of this slide a sharper increase starting in 2019, But keep in mind that that's because here we are adding for the first time the number of people living in internal displacement because of disasters. Before that date, we only had conflicts and violence. So that also explains the rise. But in any case, conflicts and violence also led to an increased number of IDPs. So that's also captured in that rise. And as you can see, we arrived at almost 76 million people living in internal displacement globally at the end of 2023. 68 million of these were living in internal displacement because of conflicts and violence. So we have actually only around 8 million who were living in internal displacement because of disasters. But let's also keep in mind throughout this entire session and throughout this conference really that disaster-related internal displacement is vastly underreported, underdocumented, underestimated, like many of the phenomena we discussed this morning as well. I mostly wanted to show you this so that you would get a sense of how widespread the phenomenon of internal displacement is. And last year, to give you a better sense, we recorded internal displacement, so forced movements within one's border, in 151 countries and territories. So as you can see, it's really touching every region, every income group. We had high-income countries, low-income countries being affected by conflict-related, disaster-related displacements, and you can see this here. The blue color represents disaster-related displacements, and orange represents conflict and violence-related displacements. Thank you. Yes, so this is really focusing on disasters. I'm trying to narrow down the funnel so that we get to our topic today, which is climate change-related displacement and children, even narrower and narrower. So here on this slide, really focusing on disaster-related internal displacements, which were over 26 million last year. I just would like to draw your attention to the graph at the bottom, because we often hear climate change is leading to an increasing number of displacement year after year. The trend is rising. We're not saying it's not true, but the data is not a consistent rise, as you can see. There have been years with decreases in the number of displacements linked with disasters. And that is often linked with outlier events. For instance, in 2022, that very high bar that you see here was linked with humongous floods in Pakistan that led to several million people being displaced, and that led to that very high figure. In 2023, we didn't have such huge outlier events. We did have 5 million people displaced in the context of the Syrian and Turkey earthquakes, and also 3 million displaced by floods in the Horn of Africa after years of droughts. We also had wildfires recorded in Canada and Greece, so really quite a variety of disasters leading to displacement. Thank you. Now, narrowing down a little bit further, we are disaggregating our figures, this time focusing on number of people by age group. And of course, you all know that we actually don't know what the real numbers are. So what we're using here is nationally available demographic data to break down our total of the number of IDPs in a particular country by broad age groups. And this is how we arrive at these estimates that around 32 million children under the age of 18 were living in internal displacement at the end of 2023. Again, the same proportions as mentioned before apply. So we actually have 28.6 million of these children who were living in internal displacement because of conflicts and violence, and around 3 million because of disasters. But keep in mind, still underestimated. So that's why we keep citing the proportion of about 40% of all internally displaced people, being children under the age of 18. But that's actually copied and pasted from nationally available demographic data. So we don't really know what that proportion is. And in some contexts, we have seen when we do collect actual data that proportion is much higher. But yeah, this has to be really adapted. It's a call for more primary data collection or better estimates if we can. Right, so I'm just really going to touch upon this because we're still very much lacking data on the actual impact of internal displacement on children and on different children, different ages, different sex, different ability status, and different profiles. And I think my colleagues will discuss these as well. But maybe just to introduce you to the way that we've tried to analyze this at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, we have been conducting research on this topic for almost a decade now, and we've come to the conclusion that there are broad dimensions that are consistently impacted by internal displacement. And those dimensions can be more or less severely impacted depending on the country, depending on the context, depending on the kind of support and assistance that IDPs may get. But in any case, these are dimensions that we think we should be looking at in every internal displacement situations to check what's happening and how the people are impacted. And these dimensions are health, mental and physical health, livelihoods, housing and infrastructure, access to good housing conditions and infrastructure, security, social and cultural life, environment, and education. As I said, we're still mostly missing actual data from internal displacement situations on these impacts on children, but I will give you a couple of examples. So I was struggling really to find some case studies that we've worked on that focus on disaster-related contexts. So they're not all climate change. There's an earthquake here, but I did want to highlight some of the kind of information that we can get and probably we should get so that we can better inform our programs and support to these children. This slide is really just highlighting to you, and by the way, these two children were internally displaced in Yemen about 10 years ago and forced to, well, first of all, not go to school, obviously, because the school was full of internally displaced people, but also try and find some means of securing money to help the family survive. And so they were spending their days gathering garbage and trying to sell it for a couple of dollars. And these pieces of data that are highlighted here on the screen are giving examples of one of the most widespread and mostly vastly documented impacts of internal displacement on families and of course on the children as well, which is a diminution in financial resources. That comes as no surprise to you, obviously, but it's interesting to see it put into data, right? So here in this first case study at the top, we see that 83% of the IDPs we surveyed in that particular situation in 2021 reported having less financial resources after their displacement. That means that when that happens, families have to make choices. And they might have to ask their children to stop going to school or help them finding food or finding resources. They might not be able to pay for transportation to school or school meals or any other education-related costs. They might have to reduce the access to good food and so on and so forth. So you're all familiar with this kind of impacts. But that's just a couple of examples of how this data can be, how this impact can be measured. Yes, another example here that actually has very direct consequences for children is the housing conditions. And again, I know you're all familiar with this already, but when displaced families are living in makeshift shelters, in informal settlements, in IDP camps, in tents, then the security of their children, in even the access to basic infrastructure, sanitation, the risk of the spreading of communicable diseases increases, as well as the risk of violence on children who are less protected in these settings. So you're seeing here again some examples of how these impacts can be measured by asking displaced people how they're living while they are displaced, and also comparing this with their situation before displacement. And again, no surprise to all of us, there is a very widespread record of housing conditions worsening after displacement. Education is probably the area on which we have most data when it comes to children. And again, a very widespread impact on internally displaced children following displacement is an interruption in their schooling. It can be short. Sometimes it's only a couple of weeks because the school is closed, because the school is inaccessible, because the families are busy rebuilding or cleaning the house that was damaged. And while that's happening, then the children are not going to school. But it can also be much, much longer. And in many case studies that we've led, we have seen that children were not going back to school for several months, sometimes for a year or more, and sometimes not going back at all. So you see, the first example here is our most recent case study. We were in Sierra Leone just over the summer in June and studying a particular case of sea level rise. That's probably the closest case study we have to measuring the impacts of climate change-related displacement. And in that situation, the island of Plantain Island, some of you may be familiar with that situation, is really disappearing year after year. The sea is rising and the land is just disappearing. So houses fall into the ocean every year as the rainy season comes and the storms come and take them. And actually, most people, they don't go very far. They just move a little bit further inland on the island still and rebuild. So you would think the school is still there. I saw the school. One classroom is gone into the sea because it's right on the beach. So it was also taken by the last storm. But the school is still there. So why would the children not be going? But still, we measured that over half of the displaced people interviewed said that their children's education was interrupted. Again, probably we can assume the children were helping them build a new house, move things back to whatever they could salvage from the damage back to their new house, or just helping out one way or another. But their education was interrupted, and they did stay out. Over half of them stayed out of school for up to 3 months. So that is leading to issues linked with their education and their learnings and so on. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to stop here and hand over to my colleagues to discuss the remaining gaps, which we are trying to work on and address in our working group. This is another call to all of you who are interested to please join our working group that we are co-chairing with Jasper, and try and improve the sex, age, and disability status data availability on IDPs, but also specific data for disaster and climate change settings, measuring better and more consistently the impacts on education, health, and other situations we just discussed. Also, the long-term consequences on development, which is particularly interesting in the case of children. And access to aid and longer-term support is another major data gap. I'm going to stop here and hand back to Jasper. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christelle. I think this was super informative, and I think this was a great start of this conversation, giving us this global overview of the trends, but also the major challenges in measuring IDP data. And I actually didn't know that, or it's always surprising to hear that you have to estimate like the actual age disaggregated data because it's actually not being measured. So this leads us to from the global level now to the national level. Let me ask Geoffrey now to come here and to present some of the ways how the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics is measuring displacement and internal displacement and especially addressing climate mobility. Thank you. Okay.
Distinguished compatriot of the children data management globally, regionally, and of course, nationally. My name is Geoffrey Ako, representing the National Bureau of Statistics, Nigeria. And it's my honor and privilege to join myself with great minds in the discourse to move children data on displacement forward. I want to quickly, using my 10 minutes, to thank Mr. Mohammed, who made sure I'm not stranded because of the flight issue I had. Tamana, thank you very much. And of course, Jasper. They all work around the clock to make sure I'm here today. Thank you very much. And of course, not forgetting to thank our veteran Tarek. I used to call him veteran Anchor. I think I first met him in Ethiopia. And I say, yes, what a way to anchor a program. He's eloquent, and of course, his disposition towards anchoring a program is a good example. Thank you very much, Tarek. Louis XIV of France in the 16th, 17th century, at the height of despotism, political tyranny, stood in front of Parliament to beat his chest and say, Loi c'est moi. Forget if I don't say it well. I am the state. And of course, they call him Louis the Great, and some call him the king, the Sun King, S-U-N. You know, you cannot avoid the sun. You cannot remove the sun. So I think he ended up becoming one of the longest serving monarch. Abi ruler for 75 years was on throne. I think France experienced war and war. And there's this saying that because he stood at the front of parliament to boast that he is the state, he didn't go down well with the parliament. And there's this saying that if you come at the king, you better don't miss. So the parliamentarians came at the king and missed. And they say where two elephants fight, the grass suffers. And I think children were most affected in that debacle. Just a story. Now, I'm here to present data issues. Sorry, which one go back and front? Okay, this one. This one is back?
Yeah, this is forward.
This one is forward? Okay. Yeah, data issues on displaced children with a special focus on children impacted by climate mobility. The outline presentation is introduction, main factors responsible for displacement, of course, flooding and displacement, impact on safe human mobility, method of data collection, challenges and opportunities, key data on displacement. Of course, climate-induced mobility is just a fraction of mobility triggers, especially in my country. And thank God, before she started her presentation, you can see the short survey. Conflict-driven mobility is by far higher than what climate-induced mobility can do. Especially in my country, Boko Haram insurgency, the farmer-herders clash, especially in the North Central, fighting, for resource which is land, being driven from the extreme north due to issue of desertification to graze on the farmer's land, has caused great or tremendous conflict that drives homes, burnt villages, and set so many people on displacement in IDP camps. Not forgetting the banditry and kidnapping in the Northwest that's arising due to the discovery of gold in the Northwest. These are serious issues that have set community ablaze and so many people displaced. Of course, children are the greatest recipient of this. Now, of course, we have main factors responsible for displacement, especially the natural one, because our emphasis here is the natural disaster. Of all these mentioned, we can say flooding is the most prominent in Nigeria out of the natural disaster responsible for climate mobility. I think flooding comes key because there's no key record that drought. But of course, desertification has really done a great damage to the country, maybe because of the position of Nigeria. Of course, the Child Rights Act has provided for the protection of children globally, which include Nigeria, of course. But looking at the data, it doesn't look as we have a Child Rights Act. When you look at the data coming from the flooding impact in 2022 to 2023, you will discover that over 44 million people were affected by that flooding for that year. And of course, we have 2.6 million children affected, and some people who were displaced temporarily in temporary refuge, accounting for 2.4. Of course, the 4.4 were the one needing humanitarian assistance. They may not be in IDP camp, but those displaced actually is 2.4 million. Of course, as water recede, most homes go back home. Just like I said, what constitutes great fear in the mind of many is a man-made disaster. And that's why you see the IDPs, the internally displaced persons, staying in camps, including children, for up to 4, 5, 8 years as IDPs. That leaves us with a huge question. But for the flooding, after 1 week, that's another thing again. For flooding, after 1 week, if you don't act fast, if you don't act swiftly, you may not get the victim because they go back after the water recedes. Some of them end up in family or relative houses because there is this pride in the south that don't allow your own displaced person to stay elsewhere other than your own home. So they distribute and you don't see them. And that's why it's always good to have a swift response in terms of data collection. If not, the data from flood victim might be lost. It's very, very important. And of course, going further, by the end of April 2023, most affected areas in the south had accounted for the bulk of suspected cholera cases, which accompanies, of course, this flooding. States like Cross River, States like Cross River State, which accounted for 718, Bayelsa 160, and of course Niger 94 of cholera cases as a result of flooding. Bayelsa, Jigawa, Kaduna, Niger were the state most hit. This record is as at August 2022 to June 2023. Of course, the source of this data is the country office report of UNICEF, Nigeria. So, looking at the breakdown, situation in numbers, you discover what I was saying earlier. There will be over 2 million people displaced, children totaling up to 2.6 million were in need of humanitarian assistance at the end of that flooding. And of course, 185,000 people that were affected accessed safe drinking water through aquatabs and chlorine. Then 13 primary health care centers were rehabilitated by UNICEF. I think it's a plus for them. 471 children receiving protection support and family tracing, reunification, reintegration, cases management services, etc. Then 8,351 households received humanitarian cash transfers. Over 107,000 affected people sensitized with key message and knowledge on mitigation of the adverse effect of flood. Because you need to educate them, because it has become a yearly practice that this flood will come, displace people, and when the water recedes, they go back. Next year, so it has become like a recurring decimal. Every year it happens, and people are getting used to it. So which is a misnomer, and that's why the sensitization is very, very important. Of course, my agency report, the NBS, the National Bureau of Statistics, Nigeria Flood Impact Recovery and Mitigation Assessment Report, carried out alongside the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, and of course, United Nations, UNDP, in 2023, shows that the survey was carried out in 6 states: Anambra State in the southeast, Bayelsa South-South, Delta South-South, Jigawa Northwest, Kogi North Central, of course, Nasarawa North Central. Shows that overall, 64% of households were affected by flood in 2022, with impact on livelihood, housing, food security, and access to basic services such as health, school, and of course, most children were heavily affected by this. Now, method of data collection. Of course, the IOM displacement tracking report, if you look at the pre-2014, it was done alone. But I personally wrote the IOM and said, for your data to be acceptable, especially on the administrative side, we have to collaborate. And they wrote my office in 2020, and the collaboration started in earnest in 2021 with the National Bureau of Statistics releasing some of our staff at the state level to be trained by the International Organization for Migration, and they go to the camps, of course, and collect this data collectively, so that the sense of ownership of this data will be together. Of course, it's done with the state actors like the SEMA, the state emergency management agencies, some of the key NGOs, and the aim of this is to have a harmonized data on displacement, other than the IOM doing it alone before, which render that data not usable or not knowing, or not sure of the source of how this data were generated. But now we are in the know of what is happening because we are fully part of this data collection process. So we can use it for administrative data because we are fully part of the process. Of course, the Nigerian Fraud Response Report by UNICEF is another method of data, which is a survey carried out too. Then we have the first ever survey of internal displacement. I would have loved to bring the statistics here, but I think as I'm speaking now, the second validation is going on to release the report. So it was carried out solely by National Bureau of Statistics and funded by National Bureau of Statistics. All the stages from beginning to the end. No donor funding, we do not go camp in hand to source for that funding, because when the Assistant General of the Federation come on board, he made the issue of migration and internal displacement his key areas that deserve his priority attention and say, let's start small. So we started with 7 states, and we were intended to carry it forward from next year with more displaced areas being covered in our service. And the result, when it comes out, of course, is very, very interesting, because all players, all partners, both local and international, we are carried along during the instrument development. That at a point we need to call EGRIS and, of course, JIPs to make sure we get their input either online or physically before, during the training, the data collection, data analysis, and, of course, validation. I'm already. So we have the flood impact survey too, which was done alongside with NEMA and UNDP. So you can see we have two surveys, and by the National Bureau of Statistics to measure displacement. That has to do with children. Of course, we have the administrative survey, where we send questionnaires to all ministries, departments, and agencies of government, because that's our mandate, going by the NSS, the National Statistical System, to send questionnaires, which will be filled and returned back, and that form the component of our demographic bulletin, the annual demographic bulletin, that we use for planning and of course, project implementations. So, of course, challenges. It may be the same with most of the African third world and, of course, developing countries. The issue of limited resources is a huge challenge. And, of course, cultural barrier is a huge challenge, especially in the north. Issue of language, we are overcoming that already. Of course, issue of logistics, issue of having limited partners, insufficient cooperation from key agencies, and of course, issue on how to address missing or displaced children, which of course some of you have tackled in the morning, enumerating IDP in host communities, and this is a key problem. The problem with my country, especially for IDP not in the camp, the host community. If you say you want to enumerate or take record of IDP in host community, everybody become IDP because they think government is bringing something to the table. So everybody will tell you we are IDPs, even those are not IDP. So how do you filter those that are the real IDP that may need material assistance and those that are not? So it's a key problem. And of course, the issue of hard to reach areas, either that mountainous areas, riverine areas, these are areas very, 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 very hard to reach, though we are doing everything we can. And the issue of insecurity, even though there are displaced people, and Boko Haram tell you you cannot come in, bandit, the headsmen say you cannot come in, of course, it will be difficult for data collectors to come in. So though we have a margin of errors at the end of the day to tell you this is why we cannot enter this area, but of course, it does affect accuracy of findings. So as I round up, so you can see these statistics from the DTM, which of course we are a key part of, from close to 10 states. And you see, as at December last year, we have over 3 million IDPs. Over 3 million IDPs. And over 98% driven by man-made inducement mobility. Over 98%. I'm assuring you, even the result of the survey has corresponded with this report. It's only few that say they were displaced by climate inducement. So looking at the ages, if you look further, you see those between 0 to 17 years form more than 70% of those in IDP camps. Those 17 and below form more than 70%. And if you see the age breakdown, those within the age of 15 to 17 are more in the camps. So what does this say? If there's no appropriate education for them or skill development strategy for them in the camps, these children will turn out to be serious problem that we tend to solve. And let me say something as a roundup, because I think this should be the last. Yeah, as a roundup. The young man that spoke in the morning about the sociology of data storytelling. Let me just oppose it with what I think our Islamic philosopher, Ibn Khaldun, have said about evidence, where they converge. Ibn Khaldun converge on thought with Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine Aurelius on evidence. That evidence is what a leader, I'm talking about data now, evidence is what a leader should see and break down. Not just for the fun of it, break down sincerely and have an attitude adjustment. And that attitude adjustment has to do with what? Putting everything on the table to make sure the issue is solved. Ladies and gentlemen, are we ready to solve the problem? Or just to look at data and we are satisfied? I think we should agree with these three callers to make sure evidence-based should be a source of worry with the aim of resolving it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey, for this very detailed picture of how you're collecting the data, and it's promising that you're already having these collaborations with IOM, DTM, and UNICEF on collecting child-related IDP data. Just one reminder for everyone in the room, the Q&A is still ongoing, so please submit your questions and rank the questions. You can vote for the questions you're most interested in. I hope that we will still have time in the end. And now we are going into the more thematic segment of this session. Now starting with Miriam, talking about durable solutions. So with further ado, please go ahead.
Actually, let me get it.
Oh, sorry.
I will remain seated just to mix things up a little bit. Okay. So yeah, my name is Miriam Kushnitsky. I'm from JIPS, the Joint IDP Profiling Service, and I will speak a little bit, and I really try to stay within the time. So bear with me as I literally run through the presentation. Speak a little bit about durable solution analysis and how children are and should be considered in durable solution analysis, but also what are the gaps and how can these potentially be overcome. It's not realistic to actually confront all of that in 10 minutes, but here we go. Oh yeah, that's fine. Let me start. So there are two things that I will mention a lot in the next 10 minutes. One is the IDAC framework on durable solutions for internally displaced persons. I think those people in the room who have worked on IDPs before are familiar with it. It's a key guiding document and framework for the work on internally displaced people. And it includes, among other things, a definition of durable solutions, which you can see here. And I'm not going to read out just to save some time. Did I skip one? No, that's fine. When I speak about durable solution analysis now, I speak on it with a JIPS perspective, so how my organization JIPS tends to address a durable solution analysis. Some key aspects of a durable solution analysis you see here. So one is it's a comparative analysis. So when we do this analysis, we don't only look at IDPs, but we only look at the non-displaced population, for them to serve as a benchmark, but also to understand, okay, what vulnerabilities are now specific to internally displaced people and what vulnerabilities are shared with the non-displaced population. It's also a cross-sectoral analysis that looks at different sectors. And here again, we link to the IDAC framework, which presents 8 different criteria that should be reached in order to reach a durable solution. I show it in the next slide in a second. So we look at criteria among these 8 IDAC criteria within a durable solution analysis. Then a phrase that we heard a lot today and will continue to hear a lot, I think, for the next 2 days is disaggregation of data. We do that with a durable solution analysis as much as possible with household surveys. At a minimum, we disaggregate by sex and age. But of course, and I think you mentioned that there is much more to be disaggregated, which doesn't mean we need to disaggregate all data, but the data, the indicators that are relevant to sex and age and other aspects. Then the methods taken is, the biggest part is a household survey, and then embedded within findings of qualitative data collection and a context analysis. And across all of this, durable solutions are a collaborative effort, like no one agency can find durable solution by themselves, and so should be a de-analysis as well. So we should bring different actors together to conduct a durable solution analysis. Can I see your time a little bit then? That would be perfect, just to stay. Here are the 8, perfect. Here are the 8 IDAC criteria. I'm not going to read all of them out, but just to see that it's quite widespread, and a lot of these topics already came up today as well. So it's safety and security, issues around HLP, documentation, of course, specifically relevant for children, family reunification, etc. In order to make the best use of this IDAC framework that I have mentioned before on durable solutions for internally displaced people, the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of IDPs initiated that under the facilitation of JIPS, there was the creation of a durable solution analysis guide accompanied by a durable solution indicator library that lists indicators for each of the 8 IDAC criteria to guide a durable solution analysis and can act as a helpful tool for all actors involved in that area of data on internally displaced people and durable solutions. I listed a few indicators here for you to see that are either specifically on children or are really relevant in order to understand the context of internally displaced children. And I want to now dive into one of the IDAC criteria, the adequate standard of living, that includes aspects of access to basic services. And as you have mentioned before, education is one of them, and education is typically that topic that has the most disaggregated data because it concerns children, and the most information on children generally in a common durable solution analysis. So I would like to zoom into this criteria specifically a little bit and look at some indicators and also some findings that one can get out of such a durable solution analysis. And here we're looking at indicators for household surveys. And household surveys can be addressed in two different ways. So either we ask questions on the individual level, so we speak to the head of household or the representative of a household, and we ask them specifically for information from each single member of the household. So this, it's 3 example indicators. It's not exhaustive, the list, but these are 3 indicators that we inquire about on the individual level. So that is the primary and secondary school attendance, covered by and access to essential health services, children under the age of 1 who are covered by all vaccines, just as 3 examples. And then we have household level questions. So these are just generally asked for the whole household and cannot be further disaggregated afterwards because we don't know specific information for each person in the household, including each child in the household. And for example, 3 indicators that seem relevant also to understand the context of children is the target population with access to basic sanitation facilities, food insecurity, and the target population with no access to drinking water. Just 3 examples out of more. And I encourage you, I have in the end a list of links, and I encourage you to also look at this indicator library if you have interest in these. Great, surprised. Okay, then a few findings of past GIPS durable solution analysis exercises from Sudan as well as the Philippines. Just to understand from a durable solution analysis that is not specifically focused on children, but also, of course, always also includes children, what kind of findings we can get out of it, just as little snapshots. One is reasons for not sending children to school, and I think everyone who's working with children, this is quite common. These reasons are quite aligned across different contexts, but it's often a lack of funds, children being required to work at home, or that the distance to the school is too far. Another finding from Darfur in Sudan was the lack of security and how it affects specifically women and children who have to go to water points through unsecure areas in order to fetch water, and how then women and children are specifically affected by these insecurities. And lastly, open defecation as generally a major problem, but specifically also a major cause of death for children under 5. And 2 more examples from the Philippines. One is, again, in regards to the access to schools, but a different angle. So a lot of times we found that discrimination and bullying presented a barrier for children in the Philippines to attend school, and also a high rate of IDP children who didn't have access or didn't own any official identification documents, which limited them to access high school and further education. And lastly, and this is maybe less a finding and more of a recommendation, and this also doesn't come out directly of a household survey, but how I mentioned in the beginning that it has to be accompanied by also understanding the context and qualitative data analysis. So one of the findings here was that children of deceased combatants should be given a top priority to access education to minimize the risk of further radicalization and recruitment of children to armed groups. With these really quick insight of what a durable solution analysis is and what kind of findings can come out of it and the different indicators linked to it, I now want to really quickly, and I think a lot of this is actually repetition of what has been shared before, but doesn't hurt to say it one more time, some findings or some reflections on the main gaps, but also how we can potentially overcome these. And as the first one, the obvious one is that there is just a limited amount of data that is disaggregated by age specifically. So generally there's limited data collected on children, especially on the household level, especially when using household surveys. The reason is often that data is collected on a household level, so it's missing out on the nuances of the individual household members. Of course, in the future, more relevant data, again, it doesn't have to be all data. Not every indicator has to be disaggregated, and the findings don't have to be disaggregated always, but the relevant ones, yes. And of course, in a way, it's easy to say to increase the disaggregation of data, but of course, it's also always, it takes a lot more resources and time and efforts. And I think one overlapping challenge in all of this is also, in this context, a lot of times the lack of funding for also including, for example, increased qualitative data collection to accompany the household surveys. Another gap is that generally, this is the case for the Durable Solution Indicator Library, but also other relevant toolkits, that they don't have that many. They do have indicators on children, but not that many with a special focus on children and their internal displacement context beyond the obvious ones like access to education or documentation like birth certificates, etc. So this is something I think that should be inspired to just, maybe it's not a lack of indicators out there, but more like the issue of compiling all of the relevant indicators that already exist and working together of maybe like something like the Durable Solution Indicator Library to compile these. And I know there's a working group on that. So maybe that's the next big effort. And then these can also, of course, be better disaggregated. And then lastly, when reflecting on what kind of data or information we have on children, how did we collect the data? Most of the time, the data has been collected on children and not from children. So it was people speaking on behalf of children and youth, less than information coming directly from children and youth to influence the data, and especially to influence not the data, but the analysis of data and to contextualize data sufficiently. And this is a problem, and there's also information that will get lost in that process, and there's a lack of nuances in that. And of course, there are limitations of how children can speak to their own issues and challenges and vulnerabilities for multiple reasons. But where it is possible, there should be made use of that, and their qualitative data collection to accompany surveys really is a big opportunity. And again, linked to another working group which works on innovation, I think that it's really important to come up with these innovative approaches to include data or information from children rather than only on children. And then as my last point, basically to address these gaps better overall, it's really important. I spoke about Durable Solution needing a collaborative approach, and there it's also really important to make sure that there are relevant stakeholders who have the knowledge and expertise on children, also with all the sensitivities that come with it. And I don't know if I think we speak about this tomorrow. To really have a better understanding, and that includes local government, basic service providers. This can use qualitative methods of mapping basic services as well, and relevant agencies, of course, as UNICEF, local NGOs working with children, etc. So I leave it as that. Okay, I was over time, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And I think this was a great first thematic track here, Durable Solutions. And now we're going into the climate space, starting with Sebastian. Yeah, please go to the podium if you want. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'm presenting on behalf of the IDAC UNICEF team and the core report writing team from this Climate, Mobility and Childhood report that we published last September on the intersection of data, children on the move, and climate. IDAC currently does not have a working group or a specific report or a project working on climate. However, given the importance of the topic and the number of children already on the move, in this context, we wanted to publish something. We want to get ahead and examine the well-being of the population and the role of data on statistical systems in protecting them. So this document, we try to answer questions like, what do available data tell us about the children on the move for climate-related reasons? How will the intersection of climate and human mobility affect children's well-being, and what do policymakers need to know? This report was supported by all IDAC members, experts, and youth working on the nexus of climate change, migration, displacement, and data. And it also presents noteworthy initiatives from IDAC partners. There. So apologies to Christelle in advance, but in this report we have an estimate on how many new displacements of children have happened due to weather from the 2016 to 2023. We do a very rough estimate that 62 million internal displacements of children were linked to weather in these 9 years. But these results are very far from perfect, not from perfect data and from a very questionable methodology, but we wanted to have like a very rough estimate. So first of all, of course, the children-specific data, and especially in low-income countries, some with high climate risks are often unavailable. And like Christelle mentioned, these are a number of new displacements, not stock numbers. And we are basically assuming for this estimation that the children are affected equally as the general population, which we know it's not the case. Also, and you probably receive this question all the time, UNICEF, the data analytics team, will receive the question all the time about how many children will be displaced in the future, especially linked to climate. And these projections, of course, have very wide variability, uncertainty, and of course the relation to climate, the relationship of climate and movement is not straightforward. In this report, we emphasize the need for standardized definitions and terminology related to climate change and human mobility. However, establishing clear definitions in this space remains challenging, especially in translating them into statistical definitions. And these are some of just the keywords, some of the keywords that we need working on standardization. And when stakeholders use consistent, agreed upon terms, efforts to protect children affected by climate mobility become more effective. I'm going to go fast. We have a little bit there. And it's not only unclear how many children are or are likely to be on the move, but because of the impacts of climate change, but also how mobility or immobility will shape their lives. And these are just some of the dimensions that we need to pay attention, and we already heard from some of these. So rigorous efforts are needed to answer these types of questions. So how does poverty interact with displacement driven by climate change? How will a child's health, food security, nutrition, and access to safe drinking water and proper sanitation be impacted? And which groups of children are at most risk of missing out on school and experiencing violence, exploitation, and abuse? Oops. And climate migration, of course, intersects with a wide range of topics, this adding complexity to the data collection process. Factors such as gender, socioeconomic status, conflict are all crucial to understanding how climate affects migration patterns, but they pose significant challenges from the data perspective, from the statistical perspective, each layer adding more data that we need to collect and analyze. So I'm going to this. There. In the report, we pose these 11 questions that we try to answer. We attempt to address them globally using available data and literature. And in some cases, we rely on data not specifically focused on children, but on migration related to other factors such as conflict. One particular important question is the last one. So how serious are the data gaps on climate mobility among children, and how can we address them? This is not, so I would encourage you to review the brief, explore these questions, and consider whether you have relevant data or in your context that can help them answer, or any projects that you would need to collect the data, and perhaps even how can IDAC partnerships can help you support answering these questions in your context. And then the fourth presentation with a data gaps slide. But this is related to mostly on climate. So what are the key data gaps? The current predictions on migrant and displacement really account by age. Another one is climate can act as a vulnerability multiplier, intensifying factors and intertwined with poverty or other dimensions which contribute to displacement. So the question of attribution to climate needs to be carefully addressed. There are also key data gaps in the decision-making or immobility in the context of climate. Who stays, who's left behind, and how much of the migration or displacement is cyclical. So addressing these gaps is crucial for ensuring that future policies are based on robust evidence. Last, so almost final, we have some noteworthy initiatives highlighted in the report. I just want to highlight this, the first one. In 2016, the Nepal National Statistic Office conducted its first national climate change survey, analyzing household impacts from disasters, climate change knowledge, and well-being. And a follow-up survey now gathers age and sex disaggregated data on mortality, injury, and other aspects, and climate-related migration. And Nepal also included climate-related disasters as a reason for migration in its 2021 census. So I think it's, yeah, a noteworthy initiative. And there's more of non-Save the Children and Mixed Migration Center with some colleagues here that you can probably talk about. So with that, thank you. I invite you to review the brief. I think we have some printed booklets. I don't think there's enough for everybody, but I think there's some in the back. And lastly, I want to mention the key report team that made this thing possible. Rose Allen, currently with IOM, and Naomi Lind with UNICEF. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. And now Josiah will finish our discussion by showing us the research agenda for what kind of angles can we take in the future for this research on climate mobility. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Esper, and good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks for hanging in there after lunch. I'm just going to be very quick and actually cut through some of my content in the interest of wrapping up on time. I am coming from UNICEF's Global Office of Research and Foresight. I'm sorry, Jasper, can I? There we go. What I want to do here is flag some propositional areas for further inquiry, drawing off of the extensive work that colleagues in this room have provided from the data and analytics space. This is not meant to be comprehensive. It's meant to spark some initial discussion. But to understand how we can further identify gaps, raise questions, even add additional complexity, and then solve that complexity in this intersection of childhood, mobility, and climate change. I want to start by very, very briefly framing the approach that we use at UNICEF. Don't worry, I'm not going to read through this slide, but just to say that, you know, we need a starting conceptual framework for research, just as colleagues in the room need a starting statistical framework for analysis. The one we use in Int'l takes a socio-ecological model as its foundation, and we situate the child within multiple levels, but also across a spectrum, a continuum of mobility. And from that asks a number of additional questions. In the climate space, and again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we're situating how cyclical exposure to both rapid and slow onset climate change can, over a series of time sequences, lower a child and a household's capacity to handle shock. And then again, how does that work in the context of mobility? So we're multiple levels of complexity here. But it really boils down to, I think, three core research pillars for us. How do we systematically conceptualize the interlinkages between childhood, internal displacement, and climate change? And how do we understand that through different demographics, between different groups of children at different stages of their life course? At the different levels I mentioned, from household through to institutional, at different stages of their migration journey, and in response to different types of climate shock. The second pillar is, what does this mean in practice? What works? What does safe, effective, inclusive, child-sensitive IDP management look like in practice? And that means going right down to our operational assumptions. And third, how can we prepare for what comes next? How can we use foresight to anticipate and plan for supporting the sustainable protection, access to rights, potential of children and youth living in context of climate-driven internal displacement for the future? I'm going to skip through some of this, but just to say that at UNICEF, we had an opportunity to take a look at the last 30 years of our research on children engaged in migration and displacement. And some of the key reflections here, I think, wouldn't be surprising to anyone in this room. We have some major understudied topic areas. We lack disaggregation in the research space, let alone the data space, by gender, by children living with disabilities, by key protective factors. We lack a greater role for children's voices, not just reflected in the data, but also as co-creators of knowledge itself. We lack a lot of research on what actually works. So we have research that theorizes, research that adds more data analysis, more words to already a very, very crowded space. But drilling down, what do we know is programmatically effective? What is scalable? Where are the pain points? We would consider that an implementation science-led approach, and we're calling for more of that methodologically. And then better leveraging of foresight, thinking about what is coming, not just what is here today. And of course, strategic alignment across the evidence ecosystem, because we use terms interchangeably: data, analytics, research, evaluation, foresight. We're seeing this as part of one spectrum aimed at one problem space, which is children engaged in internal displacement and accelerated by climate factors. And I want to end here by just throwing out a few potential research domains. We would argue that we need better understanding of the patterns and drivers of climate-driven displacement, including how specific climate events, we heard about flooding in Nigeria, for instance, how that differs from droughts and extreme heats. It's very context-specific, so we need regional variations in climate impact analysis. We need to understand the vulnerability of children and their families in internal displacement contexts. We also have to understand and appreciate, and honestly, in the telling of these stories, celebrate the adaptive capacity of affected communities in terms of their resilience and as sources of innovation. We do need to understand and be more full-throated in our defense of child protection and rights in the context of not only IDPs but migration. That means understanding legal and policy frameworks in place, including IDPs' access to housing, land, and property rights, access to basic essential services. Urbanization, the role of cities, the adaptive capacity of cities, understanding urban planning governance approaches to enhancing adaptive capacity of cities to accommodate IDPs in climate-driven contexts. Governance, policy, institutional responses, policy analysis, policy research, data-driven policy research that understands the impact of policies on sentiments in the population, the impact of population sentiment on the drivers of policy, understanding policy as a ecosystem and what the drivers are and where our advocacy inputs can be. As I said, what works? What works at the programmatic level? What works at the granular, tangible level for actually affecting impactful positive change in the lives of children and their families in internal displacement context? We need to understand at a behavioral economics level, at a cultural ethnographic level, social cohesion, community relations, because this isn't just about the populations that are displaced. It's also about the populations that are receiving these groups of people. And then this might be most relevant for Working Group 4, but I think it applies to all of us. How can we be more innovative in adapting future scenarios and foresight planning, thinking about today, 5 years, 10 years from now, maybe 20 to 30 years from now? What do the trends tell us? Are there cutting-edge analytics approaches, say predictive analytics, agent-based modeling? These are areas that take us out of the traditional research space that we need to talk at a technical level to our data colleagues on. Obviously, that's very easy to answer, so we have 50 seconds on the clock. But just to say that this is, a very large space, but this is where we need collaborative dialogue, and I'm very, very happy to trade a coffee over the next couple of days and unpack some of these ideas further. Thanks very much for your time. Cheers.
Thank you much, Josiah. And this already serves as closing remarks because you really got a perspective into the research avenues here. As you said, we ran out of time, but at least I would like to use this opportunity to maybe ask one question that was asked by one of the audience members. Maybe to all of you, like whoever would be, would be interested to answer. So I'm just reading it out. Can the ethical challenges of quantitative data collection with children be overcome, or is qualitative data collection the only ethical way forward? And it kind of alludes to this idea, and I think you, Miriam, talked about this briefly, about this data gap of like hearing the voices from children. How can we improve the agency of children in the data we are collecting with IDPs? Is anyone interested? Yeah, Josiah.
Well, not to be kind of trite about this, but you could talk to them and ask them. That's a starting point. I also just want to say very briefly, it's a really important question. I'm glad that we're talking about ethics. It was alluded to in the last discussion, but it's also a false dichotomy. We're talking about mixed methods. Qualitative, quantitative are inseparable, and so it's not can we, it's how do we, because if we can't assure ethical data collection in any regard, we shouldn't be doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah, please, Geoffrey.
Yeah, Mercy, unfortunately now, since the first national DP data is not yet out, we use the two methods, both the quantitative and the qualitative. The quantitative from the IDP comes, knowing the numbers and what they go through. Then we go to the host community hosting the IDPs because they're equally important. And that is qualitative. Qualitative in the sense that you want to get more insight into the plight of the IDP and, of course, just oppose it with the issue surrounding the host community because insecurity in the host community may trigger even an unwanted situation with the IDPs themselves. So the quantitative, of course, is good, but qualitative will give you a deeper understanding that you cannot really unearth using only the qualitative method. So the both methods are very important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do you have any thoughts on this?
On that one? Sorry, I'm cheating a little bit because we were also checking out the questions. There's one I really would like to clarify though, because it is true that Sebastian and I were using data on internal displacement and we were not arriving at the same conclusion because you used only weather-related disasters. Well, my figures were also included in geophysical hazards such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and so on. So that's the reason why, in case there's any doubt in the room, we're not wrong. We just didn't clarify what was behind our data, but that was an important point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christophe, for this clarification. And yeah, we're out of time. So thank you so much. Big applause to our speakers. And I hope we can continue the conversation. Thanks.
And before you leave, hello, because I will be moderating the next session, I was mandated or asked to pass the information that the coffee break will be of 10 minutes. We are so concerned by the timing of the conference that we would like to stick to that, so 35.